Hello. I've been analysing some of the data we got from the third test we did on Horseshoe Lake, and I'm afraid this video is a little bit technical. It's just replaying the telemetry with some of the video we took and a commentary by me trying to diagnose how the boat is sailing. I should say that I know absolutely nothing about sailing, and I don't really want to know anything about it. I'd much prefer to have an electric motor and a propeller, which is something that I would understand. Fortunately, Dick is more of an expert, but he, on the other hand, does not have the telemetry to hand. So I'm making this commentary in the hope that it will be helpful to Dick in his redesign of the sails, etc.
Consider this straight line portion where Woodstock is sailing towards P2 and the wind is from the northwest. I'm playing this back at half real time. You see that the autopilot has defined a course of 227.9 degrees, and there's a reasonable speed of over 1 knot. The actual orientation of the boat, the heading of the boat, is 234, which is, say, 5 degrees to windward of the desired course. Course over ground, as shown by GPS, is very, very close, within 1 degree of the desired course. The boat rolls only to port, as you would expect with wind on its starboard side. It doesn't roll much. Whenever it does roll, I think the heading turns very slightly into the wind. But that is counteracted by the negative rudder that the helmsman applies, which is never more than 4 degrees. So everything is fine there. I'm happy with that. Very slight weather helm, no problem, nothing extreme. And that was, I would say, a broad reach. Contrast that with this second situation where, having reached the P2 waypoint, the autopilot wants to turn towards E on a course of 109, but the helmsman is unable to achieve that course and instead establishes a course of 138. We know that the wind was very nearly behind the boat, because at one stage the jib was out one side and the mainsail was out the other side, but it's very slightly on the starboard side, from the starboard side of the boat, which explains why it's rolling very slightly to port. The helmsman applies a constant 25 to 28 degree port rudder, and yet the boat continues in a straight line on the 138 degree course. With the wind almost exactly behind the boat, perhaps it is inappropriate to talk about lee helm or weather helm in this circumstance. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that whilst running before the wind, we applied a 28 degree port rudder, but were unable to turn to port. A possible explanation for this might be that if the mainsail was out on the port side and the jib was ineffective, then that would tend to rotate the boat clockwise, and the port rudder was simply resisting that force. The situation would have been reversed had the mainsail been out on the other side, but if just by chance it was on the port side, perhaps, but we cannot verify that because we don't have video of it. Of course, if the mainsail is shielding the wind from the jib, making the jib ineffective, then the centre of effort of the two sails combined moves a large distance astern, and that's another way of stating the same behaviour. Contrast that with what happened on the third test, where the boat went into the trees. The wind is from the southeast, and we know that the boat is going roughly downwind because at that point a jibe occurs. And then we get a couple of gusts which the helmsman manages to control, and then finally we get a big gust which the helmsman cannot control, and the boat swerves 50 degrees to port. I'm not bothered about that, that's rounding up. But now consider this. We're going in a straight line. We're sailing a broad reach with the wind on our port side. The heading of the boat is 60 degrees off what is desired, and the helmsman applies 30 to 40 degrees of starboard rudder, but it has no effect. The boat continues in a straight line. This can only be described, it seems to me, as a massive amount of weather helm. Here we have the third test that we did after Dick had reefed the sails. The wind is from the south-southeast, but it's hard to tell exactly what direction it's blowing from in view of the trees. But the boat seems to be mainly heeling slightly to starboard. And the the helmsman is steering a bit to starboard, but the actual course is somewhat off what was intended, the straight line from S to P3. I think this is consistent with slight weather helm. Here we see Woodstock approaching the red circle around P3 waypoint, and when it gets into it, the autopilot changes to P4 now, and the helmsman applies 60 degrees rudder, rapidly reducing, and the boat turns through more than 90 degrees. So that was perfectly okay. After P3, the boat was initially going directly towards P4, but then it swerved to the south. The autopilot has set a course of 95 degrees, which is right, but the actual course it's following is 108 degrees, and its heading is 140 degrees. The south-southeast wind is blowing the boat over quite a lot. It's basically on a beam reach, or a very broad reach, and the helmsman is applying 35 degrees of port rudder, but it still continues oversteering to the south. So this is consistent with a fair amount of weather helm, and perhaps the boat being blown sideways by the wind. The sync between the video and the telemetry on this short section, it was tricky and cannot be relied upon. Here we're supposed to be sailing in a straight line towards E on a course of 196, but the actual heading is more like 211, 212, and the course over the ground is similar, and the boat is heeling to starboard. I think the wind is directly from the south at this point, and so the boat is in a very close hauled situation. The helmsman applies a small amount of port rudder in an attempt to achieve the 196 desired course, but even when it does so, the course over the ground is still higher at 200 or above. Possibly the southerly wind is creating a current on the lake which carries the boat northwards at the same time as it is sailing in a south-southwest direction. Eventually what happens is that by accident the boat turns across the 180 degree bearing, and the wind is, in other words, it turned directly into the wind, and then the wind is blowing on the opposite side of the boat, so it as you can see now, very rapidly changes direction, and the helmsman applies 60 degrees of starboard rudder and manages to bring the boat back on course, including turning through the wind there. But the speed reduces to almost nothing. Still, I think that was quite a good effort on the part of this helmsman. Just indicates the difficulty of sailing close to the wind there.
So those were a few examples of situations which I thought I could diagnose from the data that we had. I should say that it's actually extraordinarily difficult to accurately synchronize the telemetry with the video that we have. One of the lessons is we really do need the onboard camera, which on the third test did run out of battery. But we need that because that's the easiest one to sync with the telemetry, and once you sync that, then it's possible to sync other video that you may have, such as the stuff from the shore or from the air. If anybody understands sailing better than I do, by all means put a comment in and explain what I've got wrong. And thanks for watching.